question that has been guiding earlier Catholic social teaching on technology has always been, it is not just about what we acquire, it is about who we become.
A vision of a society that does not put power for its own sake at its summit, and that is not governed by power for its own sake, but that is founded on a recognition of the God-given dignity of every human person.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Faith at the Frontiers where we discuss the papal encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, Pope Leo XIV's first encyclical released May 25th, 2026. Now, it's not an AI encyclical, as will become clear, but it does have wisdom about how we use and produce AI, and it contains some striking insights about how to preserve our humanity in this new age. We invited Professor Nicholas Hayes-Mota of Santa Clara University and Dr. Silvianne Aspray of Notre Dame Australia University to guide us in this discussion. Professor Hayes-Mota has been teaching Catholic social teaching for a number of years as an authority on the broader context of this encyclical, and Dr. Silvianne Aspray is doing a research project on AI and human creativity, and also happens to be married to me. It's a really, really fascinating and great discussion, and we hope that some of the wisdom from this encyclical will become more available through our conversation. Austin and I are both here with two guests, Professor Nicholas Hayes-Mota from Santa Clara University. Hi, Professor Nicholas.
Hello, good to be with you.
And somebody called Silvianne Aspray, who by some weird coincidence has the same last name as me.
Well, hello.
Actually, she's my wife. But today we're going to discuss the papal encyclical that was recently released, Magnifica Humanitas, and how that can help shape the conversation about AI. So just a question to everybody, really. Why do you think the Pope felt the need to write this encyclical? Or from a more cynical perspective, why does the Pope think he has something to say about AI?
So I can dive in. I think we learned this was coming, or at least got intimations of it, 2 days into the Pope's papacy, which is almost a year old now. He made quite clear why he had chosen the name Leo XIV. It was a deliberate reference to his predecessor in that name, Leo XIII, who's the Pope usually credited with having founded Catholic social teaching, the Church's official body of doctrine on social, political, and economic questions. And he did so through a very important document, a papal encyclical called Rerum Novarum. And Pope Leo XIII did that because he was living through the Second Industrial Revolution, when new technologies and new economic forms were upending traditional ways of life in all manner of ways, and causing widespread disruption for working people and forcing many people into circumstances that were devaluing of their human dignity. And so Leo XIII felt a need for the Church to respond to that and offer both a moral critique of what was going on in his society, but also cast a hopeful vision for how not only Catholics, but the world at large could move forward in response to those challenges. And if you're being cynical about it, you can also note that those transformations were undermining many of the traditional constituencies of the Church, which were primarily in the countryside. Workers were being compelled to move to the cities. The Church was losing many people, including to socialists on the political left. And so it was also in the Church's self-interest to respond to that circumstance. But in issuing that document, Leo XIII laid the foundation for this ongoing engagement of the Catholic Church with the big social, political, and economic questions of its time.
Right, so there's a lot of parallels with today, right? That's the point,
Yeah.
is that there's these big revolutionary changes going on in society, and this is threatening a lot of people's jobs and a lot of people's sense of security. And I guess Pope Leo XIV saw those parallels right from the start.
He did. Yes.
And he's deliberately saying, isn't he, kind of like, we have new things today that we need to have a responsibility to respond to. So, like that older encyclical was called Of New Things. And what are the new things of today that the Church might have some wisdom to bring into?
Yes.
And it's so obvious that it's this epochal change of the digital transformation. And I found around the internet right now that so many, even secular outlets, are being so happy about hearing the voice of the Church, of the Pope, talking about this, because it seems many of us are at a loss how to respond. And so it's I've even read a lot of surprise at just how much this has been welcomed. I don't know what you guys have read or what you think.
Well, to situate myself, I'm sitting in Silicon Valley. I teach at Santa Clara University, whose informal motto is a Jesuit University of Silicon Valley. And we just had an event on the encyclical last night. And I've heard appreciative reactions from people in industry and engineering. Of course, I predict there will also be some critical reactions because the Pope doesn't pull any punches about some of the things industry leaders are doing. But I do think there is a much broader audience for this than just the Catholic Church or even Christians, because there is that absence of credible moral leadership in this space. And we heard none other than one of the co-founders of Anthropic, who was present at the launch event for this encyclical, not only appreciating the Pope's effort as an atheist, but saying, we need this because we in the AI industry are in an economic structure that is not incentivizing us to do the right thing. So if we're going to develop AI in a way that will be constructive for humanity, we need people from outside to be the moral voice, to call for accountability. And that's why he was supportive of what the Pope was doing.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it was a rather cheeky question, of course, that I asked at the beginning. But I think most people are aware now that AI is raising a lot of ethical questions and deep personal questions about what it means to be human that need to be discussed in the humanities. And I agree with you that I've mainly seen very positive reactions, but that's probably because I'm in a humanities echo chamber. There's probably negative reactions to this encyclical coming from elsewhere. But I think he situates AI as part of a long trajectory of technological development and technological enhancement, which it's in that sense, it's not something radically new. It is a new technology, but it is a technology, and we've seen these kinds of revolutions and changes before. So what would you say is the stance the encyclical takes towards technology in general?
I think it's very much trying to avoid the simplistic binary of pro-technology or anti-technology, and instead asking us to step back and consider not only what uses is technology being put to, but also what values are being embedded in newly emergent technologies themselves. And are those values serving a future that we want, or leading us toward a future that we don't want? And I get a little frustrated. It's understandable and it's good for publicity, but nonetheless, I got a little frustrated hearing this encyclical framed in the press as the Pope's AI encyclical or AI document, because it's really about much more than AI. And if anything, I think it's an intervention by the Pope to say, let's get beyond the weeds of the technical discussion and the technological discussion in AI, or even the regulatory questions for a moment, and step back and ask two more fundamental questions. First, who are we as human beings? And second, what kind of society do we want to live in and do we want to build? And we need to ground the AI conversation in those deeper anthropological and moral and social questions, because ultimately this technology, Leo is saying, needs to be developed with the right values and for the right ends if it's going to serve constructive purposes. And whether it is or not is the question we need to ask, not whether we're pro-AI or anti-AI.
Yeah, I think one of the things I loved about the encyclical was how it doesn't just become this sort of curmudgeonly, grumpy criticism of everything, of all the threats and dangers and problems that AI is raising, which it's easy to slide into that, especially if you're in the humanities. But the sort of feel, the energy I got from this document was more like, this is what we need to do. This is the direction we need to go in. This is the kinds of things we need to think critically about. And this is how we need to make sure that AI is crafted, constructed, and also used. Would you agree with that?
Very much. And I think the encyclical is insistent against just the doomers that technological development of itself is not a bad thing. It's actually an expression of our God-given creativity and capacity to share in God's creative work. So there's a beautiful thing in the human capacity to innovate, and we can do marvelous things with our technology, and we have. I think to some on the humanities left, you might say, as well as some on the right, the Pope's faith in the possibility of progress will be a provocation. But the encyclical is quite clear about that. Progress is possible. And not just technological progress, which of itself is not sufficient to constitute true progress, but moral and social progress, which is ultimately the basis for that should inform technological progress.
Much more important kind of progress in the end.
Exactly, right. Technological progress without corresponding moral progress and social progress, the Pope is saying, is actually barbarism. It's not progress at all, right, as we saw in the 20th century in many ways. But the response to that is not to become pessimistic about progress, as I think a large number of people in our day are becoming, but rather to say, what are the conditions for true progress? And ultimately, they're moral conditions. Is our technological development helping us to become more human and to build a world that is truly promotive of our human dignity, of our magnificent humanity, the title of the encyclical? Or is it going to dehumanize us, as technology can, if not guided by the right values?
And I think it pushes the question by saying, often when we think about what are we as humans and what do we want society to be, that gets answered for us by, well, we made this technology and the people with the power want us to use it. And so society is going to be that. And I think it does push this really big question about the kinds of structures in our society that are kind of the conditions of the possibility that we could even seek something other than just technological progress for its own sake. Which I think this really helpfully sort of opens us up into that question, which is immensely challenging. I think it's interesting to be optimistic about it, but at least to see possibility there is helpful.
Yeah. And I don't think the Pope is optimistic. I think he's hopeful, right? He's recognizing it's really uncertain which way we're going to go. And so long as sin is a pronounced factor in our world, which it will always be as we're human beings, there are many forces pulling us towards a dark future. It's important to be realistic about that. And so if optimism means, trusting the best will happen, this is not that kind of document. And I have seen some people already interpreting it actually as a very dark document. I don't think that's quite fair, but there is a real call to pay attention to all of the terrible things that are happening, and not to turn a blind eye to those.
Yeah, it didn't strike me as a dark document, not at all. What do you think, Silvianne?
I was reminded of one line towards the end of it where he does talk about darkness and tries to interpret it from a Christian perspective, where he says, Christians see the darkness and acknowledge it for what it is, yet they do not merely gaze upon it passively, for they know the light and understand that the darkness has not overcome it and cannot defeat it. So there's a certain realism there about where there might be darkness, but there's hope. That keys in with some of the sort of setting up that I read in the document where, just to underline much of what Nicholas has already said, that we need to talk about the fundamentals of this. We need to talk about the direction in which we want things to be going. We can't just firefighting whatever emergency demands us to react. Let's not just focus on contingencies. Let's actually talk about, the sort of the moral vision. And at one point he actually writes, look, most people think that kind of it's just about watching and waiting and observing from afar what all these big tech are doing to our lives and sort of hoping for the best. And he says, with some kind of like pointedness, like, look, that's not good enough. We need to face the questions that pose themselves, especially those questions of the sort of telos, I guess we would say, kind of the good towards which we are journeying and choose as societies what kind of good that is supposed to be. So not just watching and waiting and hoping for the best. Yeah.
It gets at the very fundamental questions about what our purpose is as human beings, what we're here for, what kind of things we are as human beings. And it's trying to offer sort of guidance for AI to contribute in a good way to those things rather than to detract from them.
Trying to answer the question, what does flourishing human life look like in an age of AI? I think that's one of the guiding questions.
And if I could just circle back, Barney, to the very first question you asked about why the church is stepping into this conversation at all. I think since Leo XIII, so long as we've had this tradition of Catholic social teaching, the animating impetus for CST, for Catholic social teaching, in the Guild we call it by the initials, has been so often in our political, economic, and social life, we don't step back and ask those bigger questions, right? And it's purely technical or strategic or economic questions that are driving the conversation and ultimately determining the direction we're going in. And so the church sees itself as having to regularly play this role of intervening in the conversation that's often defined by a very small number of powerful actors, political elites, economic elites, and saying, look, there are bigger questions at stake here. All of these questions we might approach from a purely technical perspective are really moral questions. And so we need to have a conversation about those fundamentals to determine what direction we're going in. And I'd want to highlight one more thing that both Austin and Celia have spoken to, which is the question of who's in the conversation, right? And another thing this document is trying to do, I think, is to call attention to how much a very small circle, no longer even of people in the state, but of tech elites who own the big firms developing these technologies, are fundamentally answering those questions for us, even if they're not always aware they're doing so. And this document is a clarion call that that is not acceptable, right? We need a much broader conversation in which many voices can participate in shaping this trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial, really crucial. Like, there's a line I that stood out to me in paragraph 104 of the encyclical. He says, "We cannot consider AI to be morally neutral. In reality, every technical tool embodies choices and priorities through what it measures, ignores, and optimizes, and how it classifies people and situations." And that's the thing that I think the Pope is trying to help us raise awareness of, is that we have an assumed vision of what it means to be human that's embedded in the AI already. And the problem is, if that assumed vision is that basically our life is about the greatest possible convenience and comfort and ease of doing things, or about, affirmation, talking to a bot that makes me feel good because it tells me I'm asking the right kinds of things or something, that's going to shape the way we understand our humanity and the goal of our humanity. And the Pope's saying, no, we need to shape our understanding of our humanity according to what the true goals are of human flourishing, which is not necessarily just making life as easy as possible.
No, and I think even that's a relatively benign statement of the vision informing AI technologies, because the Pope also calls attention to some of the more radical and, from a Christian perspective, deeply problematic visions informing AI development, such as posthumanism, which is explicitly called out here, right? The idea that these technologies are leading us towards a kind of surpassing of the human race as AI, transcends all of our own capabilities. And I think there's a deep suspicion in this document of how AI is instrumentalizing human beings to a certain set of purposes that most of us would not remotely assent to. And yet, because it's being developed in the interests, in some cases of that grand post-human vision, but in others simply of power for its own sake, which is a theme that runs throughout the document, it's really leading us towards a direction we'd rather not go and must not go. And that's part of why I think the Pope is, among other things, trying to raise an alarm with this document, even as he's also casting that more hopeful vision.
And this is where I think oftentimes, when people talk about posthumanism and AI, they're primarily thinking about like sci-fi scenarios of uploading our consciousness or something, when they should probably be thinking about like large scale social scenarios where people have been made redundant. Yep. So that very few can, profit and control with the use of these technologies and go beyond their need for the rest of humans, that sort of thing, I think. And so these are tied together, right? That question of sort of the moral vision shaping these technologies and the kind of broader structure of who has the power to say what they're going to be. And I think that that's so helpful because there's so many people that talk all day about what they wish AI was like, but no one listens to them. So who cares, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think he's warning about the way that AI can just create a greater power imbalance because of the pursuit of power and the pursuit of people just seizing control, not just of the means of production, but of how people think, of who people vote for, by feeding them certain party lines and narratives that direct their political allegiances in certain ways. But what would you say is the positive vision? What is the kind of guidance, the right kinds of goals that we should be heading for in the way we produce and use AI, according to this document?
I think I was reminded reading this document that the current Pope is an Augustinian. That is the religious order to which he belongs, right? And I think that's reflected in this document because he's got this central image that's more or less his 21st century riff on Augustine's City of God. And he invites us to contemplate two trajectories toward which we could be going. One is a trajectory toward Babel, referencing the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. And that's a vision of human beings, as Leo interprets it, essentially pursuing power for its own sake without reference to God, with an eye toward domination and homogeneity, kind of control by those with power. He gives a very totalitarian interpretation of what the Tower of Babel is about, I would say, which looks at our diversity, which in the Bible story results from God striking down the Tower of Babel, as a negative phenomenon, right, to be controlled and homogenized. The alternative is the New Jerusalem that Leo sources from the book of Nehemiah, also in the Hebrew Bible. And this vision of, the Israelites returning to their home after the Babylonian exile, finding Jerusalem in ruins, and being called by Nehemiah to rebuild it, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And as Leo interprets the story, this is a vision that places God at the center of human society, but that also allows a place for everybody with diverse skills, diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, that honors our diversity as an asset of our creation, and that everybody gets to participate in, right, in building that city. And so that becomes the dominant metaphor for the whole encyclical, these two cities. And one is what Leo, in the last chapter of the encyclical, Babel, calls the culture of power. And the other is, Jerusalem, is what Leo calls the civilization of love. And so he's asking us throughout, although he's an Augustinian, he's also reminded me a little bit of Pope Francis, the Jesuit Pope, and I think continually calling us into discernment of spirits. Which way are we going? How are our own actions as individuals or as a society contributing to one or the other? Are we building the Tower of Babel, or are we building the New Jerusalem? And the New Jerusalem, the civilization of love, is precisely a vision of a society that does not put power for its own sake at its summit, and that is not governed by power for its own sake, but that is founded on a recognition of the God-given dignity of every human person, that on the belief that society itself exists for the sake of the person, that kind of central premise of Catholic social teaching. And the orienting end of society should be the common good, right? The flourishing of all members of society as human beings in the full dimensions of their own humanity, right, which are not merely economic, but also include our moral formation, our spiritual transcendence, our experiences of beauty, our relational richness. And Leo gives some more definite guidelines, drawing on the tradition of Catholic social teaching in the form of principles that should inform both our social and our technological design, right? Those are principles like subsidiarity, solidarity, universal destination of goods.
Just to underline really one aspect of what you said, namely that it's so much in this encyclical is about the language of building. And I think going back to this quote from St. Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians, let each builder choose how to build or how they build, kind of like the reminder that we need to choose how we are building and what we are building, and that any technical endeavor has a moral architecture that we are free to shape and to choose. So the language of building is something that stood out greatly to me through those two biblical images of the New Jerusalem and Babel. Yeah, so just to underline
it's not just software engineers who are building, right? We're all building by the way that we choose to use AI, by the choices we make in how we integrate it into our lives, and lots of different things, right?
Yes. And I really appreciated the language of building too. And I think in the United States, at least, I've noticed in our public sphere kind of a deliberate attempt to recover and center that word. Because, our politics is so characterized by demonization, by critique. In the academy, I get frustrated by this. There's kind of this often relentless focus on critique, almost for its own sake. We can find many things to critique, but ultimately the question is, what do we want to create? And Leo is really inviting not just the elites, but all of us to ask ourselves that question, but then also to take a step further and assume responsibility for being part of that creation. And so even as he's rightly criticizing all of the ways in which the participation of many is being inhibited in our present technological political economy, he's also kind of issuing an agitation to each of us we can't just criticize that. If we want to change that, we actually need to step into agency and responsibility ourselves. We can't
And
just wait.
I thought there was a beautiful consistency there, because one of the principles he gives us is this, what is called subsidiarity. And that basically means that decisions need to be, or the power needs to lie at the lowest possible level for it to make sense. And in a way, that it seems to me to imply that we all have responsibility and power in our own lives as well. And so he is consistent in empowering us.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel there's a strong empowerment there for everybody, for the faithful, for people of goodwill, to say, look, there are things you can do. And, there's this, we can talk about the Tolkien quote, if you like. There's this one quote from Gandalf in this encyclical, which people love, which is basically, we may not be able to change the tide of the times, but there's one field for us to till. And that's the areas we're given to make a difference in, and they may be small. But there are things like, and that's another verb apart from building that Leo highlighted. He talked about disarming, and he wants to disarm AI. Yes, kind of like to put it into the service of peace and justice,
Which
and
sounds
not
a little
at the service
harsh
of war.
or violent to begin
It's
with,
just
but
strong.
it doesn't mean that he wants to deconstruct it or destroy it. It just means
No.
that he wants it to be harmless.
Well, but also kind of like almost so that it could serve us. Yes, but
Yes.
then he sort of says, look, disarmament in that sense needs to start with our own language. If we are cynical and hateful and talk in sort of resigned ways as well, that's not the language of the gospel. So that's one of the things which he gives us responsibility for. Like, how do we talk? Does it build up, or does it fuel a violent rhetoric?
Right. And if I could lean into the disarmament language for a moment, I think it's striking that both in the document and in the press conference with which he launched it, Leo specifically lifted up that phrase as dear to his heart, and also acknowledged it was likely to provoke. It's dramatic language. I don't think it's harsh language. I think it's simply calling attention to what's actually going on. But Leo wants to call attention. That's why he's using it. He really wants to lift up that in particular. And I think it's important to consider the context of that language. He explicitly compares it, and so he's intentionally evoking the analogy of nuclear disarmament, right, which the church has called for quite consistently since the 1960s. And what does disarm mean in that context? It's not just asking us to consider what uses is a technology being put to, right? Nuclear power of itself is not a malevolent discovery. It's a miraculous thing that human beings now understand reality at the atomic and subatomic level and can use it and can, in theory, put it to constructive use. But it unlocks enormous destructive potential, right? And so the question of, is a destructive or a creative and generative intent informing not only the use of our technology, but even the development of our technology? Are we developing new sources of nuclear power, or are we developing nuclear weapons? You can ask the same question of AI, and Leo does. But even beyond that, I think what Leo is calling attention to in that language is there's a deeper social logic in which technological development is situated, right? And in the nuclear arms race, you had this relentless development of nuclear technology for destructive purposes because of this geopolitical competition between the great powers of the Cold War, who respectively wanted dominance over the other. And it was that desire for dominance that was driving this technological acceleration without anybody asking, what end is this ultimately serving? It's ultimately leading us towards the annihilation of the human race and making that ever more likely. And it was only through the movement for disarmament that those powers began to walk away from the brink and created some structures of international accountability to do that. And so Leo is similarly saying, I think he's rightly calling attention to the fact our current AI global political economy is an arms race. It's an arms race between the US and China, right? How often do you hear that justification for why we just need to keep developing the technology as quickly as possible without any concern for ethical safeguards or social consequences? Because if we don't do it in the United States, China will do it and they will establish their dominance. But there's also an arms race among the AI companies themselves, as each is trying to attain that technological supremacy and put the others out of business. And Leo is saying, if we continue to follow that accelerationist logic, that AI arms race, it is not going to lead us anywhere good. And so there's something you need to learn from that prior, admittedly partially successful, and in some ways perhaps now partially reversed, nuclear disarmament movement precisely because if that acceleration is logic for technology for its own sake, ultimately in the service of domination, is driving this project, it can only have a destructive end, right? And so that's why it's so important to slow down. Leo deliberately says, slowing down in this case is not resisting progress. It's actually making it possible by ensuring
It's making sure you're actually progressing rather than heading off on the wrong trajectory. Yeah, or in the wrong direction.
But there's also, I think, another context to this in the encyclical, because he does talk, and to me, in a very sort of wise and provocative way, about how the normalization of war, he calls it, how in our time we are in danger of forgetting basically the horrors of the world wars, and because it's now enough time that we no longer have the living memory, and that it becomes, he talks about a sort of a political realism called realpolitik, which says, well, we just need to arm ourselves. We just sometimes need to strike before the other party strikes back. So kind of war becoming a viable political option, sometimes even economically motivated. And Leo is so strong at just seeing this and naming it for what it is, and then harking back to saying, look, peace, to his first address when he was first on that balcony a year ago, saying it's peace that the Lord promises us and the risen Lord talked about. And saying, but that peace, it's not naive, it's not utopian just to actually strive for dialogue and reconciliation. We need to have this as just in a different kind of, a good kind of realism, that this is an option and that needs to always be the first option.
And I think that's an example of how he's, again, trying to situate this specific AI conversation in that broader conversation about society, and really calling to our attention, all of this is embedded in these larger social, political, economic, cultural structures.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It shouldn't be called the Pope's AI encyclical, because there's so much more. There's so much more in there that is his commentary on society as a whole, but also always showing how AI plays a role in these different elements of society. I also thought his summary of Catholic social teaching in the beginning of the document was brilliant as well.
Oh, yeah.
But then he brought all of those different principles of Catholic social teaching and showed how AI is affected by them, and or can be, or rather should be affected.
How we should assess AI through them. He's giving us the tools.
Yeah. And if I could speak to that for just a moment, because I haven't seen this remarked upon much in the secular press, at least. Leo has done something very profound from the vantage point of the church in this document as well. He's not only beautifully distilled Catholic social teaching, articulated its core principles. I think this will be a great teaching document. As somebody who teaches Catholic social teaching, I'm often looking at what's a digestible articulation of it, and he's given us that. He's also interpreted its historical trajectory, but in so doing, he's made this interesting and quite profound move to say that Catholic social teaching is more than just a body of principles or an ethical framework. The phrase he uses is, it's a process of social discernment. That's how he actually defines Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, it's open-ended that way. He doesn't present it as a kind of set of final answers to timeless questions.
Exactly. It's an evolving learning process, really, on the church's part. And it's a learning process that is made possible by listening both to the members of the church themselves and to the wider world. And so Leo explicitly connects Catholic social teaching to this project that was dear to Pope Francis's heart, and is also, I gather, dear to his own, of synodality, right? Of transforming the church itself to be an institution that's actually governed by internal listening and deliberation and consultation and shared decision-making. And he's quite explicit at the end of chapter 2 of this document when he concludes his summary of Catholic social teaching. All of these principles apply to the church itself and will only be a credible witness to this alternative vision of the civilization of love if we embody it ourselves. And that's a really radical move, that the church still has a long way to go in that respect. And so I think the document also has this ecclesial significance. And it's saying that, what needs to happen within the church is analogous to what needs to happen within the world. In both cases, we need to create structures and cultures of mutual learning, of mutual listening, of mutual accountability. And that's what will ensure we can have this deeper conversation and collective discernment that should ultimately inform our decision making.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think for people listening, they're probably thinking, I'm just one individual. Most of the people listening are not going to be software engineers on the cutting edge of AI themselves. And the document has a lot of advice for those kinds of people as well, right? Just the ordinary users. He talks about the personal use of AI. And I'm thinking about paragraph 100, in fact, where he talks about three sort of aspects which deserve careful consideration for the personal use of AI. Do we want to talk a little bit about those? I mean, he summarizes them as the ease with which results are obtained, the sort of false impression of objectivity in those results, and the simulation of human communication, the feeling that you're actually talking to a human being that could be dangerous.
Yeah. I think he's offering guidelines for personal discernment, right, or examination of conscience. How is each of us interacting with this technology? And are we allowing this technology to feed kind of a prioritization of ease, of, as some like to say, the reduction of friction at all costs? Not only, as a student, perhaps using AI to do my work for me, but also, think of how easy it is to order our food via DoorDash or, rely on all of these quick fixes to make our lives easier. When one of the provocations of this encyclical is to say, actually, it's the friction, it's the experience of limitation that allows us to develop and grow as human beings, right? And so at one level, he's asking us to pay attention to how we might be sacrificing our own development as individuals.
That's right. Learning is hard work, right? You
Yeah.
can't just get a computer to do it for you. You're not going to cultivate those skills. Thinking at the very, very simple, sort of almost technical level of learning a language, it's a lot of hard work and effort when you could just get AI to translate everything for you, and then you never have to learn that language. But then what kind of relationships are you going to have with people who only speak that language? The next level to make it more personal and to stop AI being the mediator requires a great deal of effort, but it enriches you. It enriches your interpersonal relationships. But that's just one
Yes.
very small example. Obviously, in higher education, everybody's talking at the moment about what it means to just learn anything in the humanities, to read a book
That's
and
right.
understand what it says, and to be able to write an essay where you express your own thoughts about it, when AI can do so much of that for you right now.
And
Mhm.
so many educational institutions have already been transformed into places where it's about optimization and ease for everybody. And so it's, again, that this isn't technology coming into a neutral space, but a space that's already primed to say, yo, good, this makes it even easier, which, again, I think helpfully implicates all of us and all of our other institutions into this question, right? To say, like, who is receiving this and what does it mean for these communities?
Yeah, and I think beyond like our level as individual AI users or technology users, there's also a question that could be we could each pose to ourselves about how we're applying this in our own vocation. So I'm a professor, and Leo explicitly names educational institutions as playing a critical role in forming people, both in the values that should inform their use of technology, their social engagement, but also in learning how to do it constructively and learning how to be critical analysts of all of the misinformation that's being circulated and accelerated by AI, right? Of paying attention to those developmental questions that are so often neglected, right? And so there's a critical role for educators here. But if you're in a workplace, asking how is AI being used to promote or to undermine human dignity in our workplace, in the layoffs it might be leading to, in the de-skilling it might be creating rather than skilling up, right? So I think each of us, not only as an individual, but as a participant in different social institutions, with a particular vocation, can apply that to the particularities of our own context and vocation as well.
And I think sort of a question that has been guiding earlier Catholic social teaching on technology has always been, it is not just about what we acquire, it is about who we become. And this question, I think, is the context for the sort of the ease and quickness of things, because using AI to do a certain task for us, it doesn't make us wiser or make us into a more virtuous person or something. But those questions about who we are becoming, I think, are
And how
crucial.
technology is changing who we're becoming, or
Mhm.
even preventing us from becoming certain things we need to become.
Do we want to talk about the other two things, the impression of objectivity and the simulation of human communication as well, that you mentioned, Barney?
Please go ahead.
So that's a very interesting one, the impression of objectivity, I thought. How we somehow, because the answers a chatbot gives us seems so authoritative and so clear
It's so slick, isn't it?
So slick that we just think, all right, this is going to be objectively the case, and forget just what we have been talking about, that there's a moral architecture through what it focuses on and chooses not to focus on, through what it enhances and what it optimizes and what it doesn't, and kind of to see, and in the way it reflects the people who are building it, who are funding it, who are there, kind of to realize, no, this is not objective. There is a particular set of values that is feeding it, guiding it, even if it may lull us into thinking it is not.
Yes. And I think for me, one of the most provocative and interesting moves he makes in this encyclical is to explicitly identify truth as a vital part of the common good, and to really emphasize the social and relational character of knowledge and of truth itself, right? Which I think speaks again to this false objectivity of AI. Leo suggests that there's a relational dimension to truth. Truth isn't just something we know as isolated knowers. It's something we learn and encounter and continually, deepen our understanding of, refine our understanding of through our relationships to others. And
it's embedded in networks of trust, isn't it? Like 99% of what we claim to know, we've been told by somebody in some form or other, and we've trusted that.
Exactly. Yeah. And we trust the processes of mutual verification, for example, and of argumentation that continue to allow us to find truth collectively, and that relies on practices and institutions. So he's really he's called attention to the social embodiment of truth. And I think that's another thread throughout this encyclical, reminding ourselves we're embodied beings physically. That's how we come to know things, but also socially and relationally. We only exist in these manifold relationships we have to each other. And that's how we collectively arrive at truth. And AI is parasitic on that, right? We've created this technology that can perform objectivity precisely because it's mined all of these human conversations made possible by that relational architecture.
And ruled out certain answers that it's deemed, that its programming has deemed unethical or abhorrent or below the bar. Yeah.
Right. And it's threatening to undermine that relational fabric that makes our collective knowledge of truth possible, right? And so that's why, again, as individuals, it's so important not only to be suspicious of AI's veneer of objectivity, but also to turn our attention to how are we contributing to the alternative to that, to truth as a common good.
A quote that struck me was very much, and basing it on what you just said, truth is a common good and not the property of those with power of influence. I find that really strong and to the point.
I think we often talk about how AI is not always accurate, but this isn't just saying that, right? Even if it's something it's saying is relatively accurate, it's still not objective. Yeah. And that is this deeper question that I think we don't often get to. And again, connects to all the things we've been saying about, right? Like so much of truth, our grasp of truth has to do with our formation into the kinds of people who can grasp something about the world. And that formation happens in community and in broader context and in relationships. And that gets sort of replaced by this sort of, information.
Yeah, I mean, truth is not just about what is correct, right? Truth is about what matters. And it's one of the things I say to people now about why I don't trust news outlets anymore. It's not because I think they're all lying all the time. It's because they are offering me a vision of what's important. They're drawing my attention to these things rather than those things, as if these are the things that I'm supposed to care about and focus on and get really angry about, when they may not be the really important thing right now.
And that speaks, I think, Leo uses this beautiful phrase in paragraphs 137, 138, in the discussion of truth as a common good, an ecology of communication. We need to build and restore a healthy ecology of communication, right? Which is not only how are we safeguarding, the relationships that make our shared pursuit of truth possible, but what are the institutions that are vital to that? He identifies journalism as one of them. And so the way in which traditional journalistic institutions are breaking down is a problem from that vantage point. but also the way in which they too are being colonized by some of these problematic logics, right? All fighting this increasingly escalating war for capturing our attention, which is another dynamic that Leo is emphasizing, and prioritizing that attention capture over other functions they might be serving that are ultimately more important for our common good.
Absolutely. Do you have any sort of top takeaway advice for people who are wrestling with how to use AI and how to think about it?
I think the encyclical is intended as an aid to discernment, to come back to that word again. And it's inviting us to ask ourselves a series of questions. Most radically, are we helping to build the Tower of Babel or the Peace of Jerusalem, right? And not only how is our AI used, but many of our other engagements serving one or the other of those ends. But I think specifically to the AI question, it also gives us this further tool for discernment, which is asking, is this helping me become more or less human? First, let me start by asking, how do I understand what it means to be human? The encyclical gives some really valuable starting points for that. To be human is to be embodied. To be human is to be relational. To be human is to be limited and to grow from our experience of limitation. To be human is to be a responsible moral agent. All of these things, right? And so once we've arrived for each of ourselves at an articulation of what we think it means to be human, then we can turn and ask, is this technology is my use of this technology in these various ways helping me become more human, or is it actively contributing to my dehumanization?
That's a really great question to have us all ask whenever we're engaging in something, right? Do you want to add anything to that, Silvianne?
No, I love that summary. I guess what Leo is doing is also, he is giving us, as you say, the tools of discernment, the right questions, because this field is changing so rapidly. He cannot give us sort of like itemized points of do this and don't do that. And that also wouldn't be half as powerful. Rather, he gives us this dynamic tool which we can apply as the situation changes. And I think, Nicholas, you summarized it beautifully here.
Well, this is how I would put it slightly differently. I'd say, is this helping me to become the kind of person I feel I should become, right? And if we're Christians, especially if we're Catholics, we're like, I want to become a saint. But like, saints are not all the same. Each saint is different. But if I'm using AI, is this AI helping me become a saint? Is this AI helping me to acquire the qualities and the skills and the virtues that God has called me to acquire? Or is it preventing me from acquiring those by giving me shortcuts? Something like that.
Right. And I think it's also important to add, not only what is it doing to me, but how is my use of it contributing to the humanization or the dehumanization of others, right? Which we so often don't pay attention to. And yet this encyclical is rich with calling attention to how the development of this technology is instrumentalizing and dehumanizing human beings in many ways, right? From those who are mining the minerals required to build the physical infrastructure, often in extremely degrading conditions, to the extremely problematic, possibly illegal mining of data, especially of vulnerable populations, right? And so paying attention to those developments too, precisely because we are, as human beings, situated always in relationship, right? Asking the individual question always also has to be asking the social question.
How is it affecting other people as well?
Yeah, that's right.
And the environmental question, how is it affecting our common home? Because that the encyclical does as well, doesn't it? Kind of all the use of resources. And in a way, that's this beautiful holistic ecology of talking about my relation to myself, my relation to you, my relation to God, and my relation to our common home. All those questions need to be held together.
Coming back to the opening question that we had, I really appreciate, Nicholas, how you've pointed out that in this encyclical, he talks about these principles, applies them to the church as well as society. And I think for, non-Catholics or non-Christians thinking about this, one thing that it's really compelling is that it's not saying, I'm the Pope and I'm going to tell you what you're supposed to do, but it's sort of casting a vision for what the church sees itself called to. and saying, this is our vision of what it means to be human, of what it means to flourish. If you find that compelling, then here's the kinds of questions that you ought to ask in relation to this to orient yourself. And I think that that's really, really profound, kind of wherever you're coming from, to have this as a resource to sort of engage in your own thinking more broadly. And it's one that's really sorely needed in our culture today, I think.
Amen.
Thank you both so much, Nicholas and Silvianne, for sharing your insights and as quick a turnaround as possible, reading the encyclical and having to commentate on it.
Thank you for the invitation and for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.